So I want you to try and imagine a very specific physical sensation. Not just a sound, but like an actual feeling.
Oh, I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, picture standing inside this colossal, concrete-walled room in a world-famous nightlife capital. And the very heartbeat of this city is defined by this relentless, heavy bass line.
Right, that low frequency thud that you don't just hear, but you actually feel vibrating, like right through the soles of your shoes.
Exactly. Up through your shoes and, right into your ribs. And every single weekend, literally millions of pilgrims from all across the globe fly in just to experience that collective physical vibration.
It's a whole ecosystem built on that one feeling.
It really is. But now imagine a switch gets flipped. Just boom. Overnight, that entire city goes dead silent.
The bass just entirely stops.
The bass stops, the steel doors lock shut, and the streets just empty out. And here is the truly wild part, the thing we are unpacking today. I want you to imagine how that very silence, that total mandated shutdown, accidentally birthed the fastest, most aggressive, and most mutated music that city has seen in decades.
It's an almost apocalyptic image, honestly, but that is the literal reality of what happened to German techno in the 2020s.
Yeah, it's crazy.
We aren't just talking about a temporary pause in some local music scene. A massive global crisis completely shattered this intricate, highly lucrative cultural ecosystem.
Right.
It forced a total collapse, and from that rubble, the culture had to rebuild itself from the absolute ground up, which fundamentally altered its own DNA in the process.
And that transformation is our mission for today's deep dive. We're looking at a brilliantly detailed column published by Monumental Movement Records back in 2025.
A really fantastic piece of writing, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. This retrospective chronicles how a localized nightlife shutdown managed to rewrite the federal laws of an entire country. I mean, it shattered the acoustic boundaries of a genre and completely redefined what it actually means to be an underground culture.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
But to really feel the whiplash of this transformation, we need to establish our baseline first. We have to look at the landscape right before the world stopped. So where exactly were we sitting in, say, late 2019?
Okay, so if we look at that pre-2020 baseline, Berlin wasn't just a city with a good nightlife district. It was the undisputed heavyweight global capital of techno.
A literal pilgrimage site.
Exactly, a bona fide international pilgrimage site. You had these massive, legendary, architecturally imposing venues, right? Places like Berghain, Trezor, About Blank, and Watergate.
Yeah, heavy hitters.
Right. And these places drove an entire economy of tourism. You had people flying in from the EU, South America, Asia, all specifically for these marathon weekend raves.
And musically, where's the sound at that point?
Musically, the ecosystem was incredibly stable. The tempo was sitting at a very comfortable driving pace. It was floating around maybe 135 to 145 beats per minute.
Fast, but not like face-meltingly fast.
Exactly. There were some creeping industrial influences, sure, but the evolution was very gradual. It was this well-oiled, highly lucrative cultural engine running at a steady, predictable hum.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because that steady hum was about to hit an unprecedented, immovable brick wall.
The biggest wall imaginable.
Right. In March 2020, that massive cultural engine didn't just slow down or sputter, it flatlined completely.
Yeah. In March 2020, the German government issued a legally mandated comprehensive shutdown of all clubs, bars, and, leisure facilities across the entire country to combat the spread of the virus.
So everything just stopped.
Everything. For the first time in its modern history, Berlin's legendary nightlife came to a grinding halt. We are talking about over 300 highly active clubs in Berlin alone falling entirely silent overnight.
Over 300 clubs.
Wow. Yeah. The lights went off, the sound systems were powered down, and the doors were literally padlocked.
And the human toll of that sudden stop is just staggering. I think we tend to just think of the famous DJs losing their gigs, right? But the entire economic infrastructure of club tourism plummeted to absolute zero in a matter of hours.
Oh, the collateral damage was massive.
Right, because you have to consider the massive invisible workforce.
Mm.
The lighting technicians, the acoustic engineers, the booking agents.
The bartenders, the logistics crews, the security personnel at the doors.
Exactly. Tens of thousands of industry workers instantly lost their livelihoods. And to survive that initial shock, they had to rely entirely on the Kurzarbeiter Guild.
Right, the government's short-time work benefits.
Yeah. How did that actually work for them?
Well, that Kurzarbeiter Guild was essentially a financial deep freeze. It's a state subsidy designed to keep employees on the payroll even when there is no work, which, prevents mass layoffs.
Makes sense on paper.
It does. But it highlighted a brutal reality for an industry that literally relies on physical proximity, sweat, and crowded, enclosed spaces. You suddenly had this immense, highly active labor force alongside a massive, passionate audience. And both groups were indefinitely confined to their living rooms.
The physical space was just gone.
Entirely gone.
It's like unplugging the central servers of the internet overnight, or capping a massive geyser. The heat, the pressure, the kinetic energy bubbling underneath the surface,
Yeah.
it doesn't just magically disappear because you plug the main hole.
No, it has to go somewhere.
Right. It builds up and finds a new, smaller, infinitely more explosive crack to burst through. And in this case, that crack was the digital realm. All that human desire to connect and create migrated online.
And that pressure absolutely found a new conduit. The data of club culture had to migrate almost instantaneously into the digital realm. The immediate institutional response was this project called United We Stream.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, it was launched by Club Commission Berlin in partnership with Arcade Concert. They took these cavernous, iconic, completely empty venues and turned them into broadcast studios.
Just cameras and a DJ.
Exactly. They live-streamed DJ sets from inside the empty clubs directly into millions of living rooms.
And what was the main goal there? Just to keep the music going.
Well, the primary goal was to solicit donations and raise emergency survival funds for the venues. But it had this profound secondary effect. It proved that club culture could actually function as digital media.
Which is huge, right?
Huge. It challenged the decades-old assumption that techno was exclusively a physical, shared space experience.
Okay, so while the DJs were spinning to empty rooms, the producers were locked in their bedrooms. And that triggered a massive shift in how the music was actually manufactured, right?
Definitely. Without access to massive multi-million-dollar recording studios or heavy analog hardware synthesizers, production shifted entirely in the box.
Meaning on their laptops.
Right. Meaning artists were making music entirely on their computers using digital audio workstations, or DAWs. And because traditional record label distribution schedules were in total chaos.
They just bypassed the gatekeepers entirely.
Exactly. They started self-publishing their tracks directly to platforms like Bandcamp.
Which brings us to what I think is the most fascinating acoustic divergence of this entire era. When reading the retrospective, this sonic split really jumped out at me.
Oh, the 2020 to 2021 paradox. It's so interesting.
Yeah. So we saw the genre split into two completely opposite simultaneous trends. Trend one was deeply introspective.
Right, because there were no physical dance floors to test tracks on.
Exactly. So a huge swath of producers simply stopped making dance music altogether. They started producing purely for home listening.
The tempos just plummeted.
They did. There was a massive surge in ambient music, down-tempo, experimental noise, droning synthesizers, and even like field recordings of empty city streets or domestic environments.
It was music specifically designed for isolation, meant to be consumed on headphones while just staring out of an apartment window.
Which makes total logical sense. You're trapped in your apartment, you make quiet, reflective drone music. But the second trend completely threw me.
The TikTok explosion.
Yes. While the ambient producers are making lockdown soundtracks, there is this simultaneous explosion of hyper-aggressive, blistering techno. We're talking 150 to 160 beats per minute. And it is going absolutely viral on social media.
It's a total pivot.
Right. Wait, if everyone is stuck at home in their pajamas, baking sourdough bread and doing jigsaw puzzles, why on earth is 160 BPM sweat-dripping, peak-time club music blowing up on TikTok? It feels completely contradictory to the reality of the moment.
What's fascinating here is that it seems contradictory, but it is actually a perfectly logical adaptation to the medium of short-form video.
Okay, explain that to me.
Well, think about the architecture of an app like TikTok. It is aggressively visual, it thrives on highly compressed attention spans, and it demands immediate high-impact engagement to stop someone from scrolling past.
So a slow 10-minute ambient track just doesn't work.
Exactly. A slow, brooding ambient track simply doesn't translate to a 15-second viral video. But a blistering 160 BPM kick drum paired with a massive, distorted visual drop.
Ah, that fits the algorithmic format perfectly.
Precisely. The music sped up to match the velocity of the internet feed.
That is wild.
And you have to remember, you had an entire generation of youth coming of age during these lockdowns. They couldn't legally go to clubs, So they were simulating the hype, the underground fashion, and the kinetic energy of the rave experience entirely online.
They are consuming the concept of clubbing.
Right, through these bite-sized, hyper-stimulating videos. So you end up with this bizarre reality where physical clubs are entirely dead, but in the digital space, techno is spinning faster and more aggressively than it had in 20 years.
And this massive online visibility, combined with the desperate fight for survival by the empty physical venues, forced the German government to basically reevaluate the actual cultural worth of these spaces.
Which led to a massive institutional victory.
Right. Out of this massive crisis came a truly historic decision. In 2021, the German parliament made it legally binding. They officially upgraded the status of clubs to cultural institutions, or Kultureinrichtung in German.
And this cannot be overstated in its importance. I mean, prior to 2021, clubs in Germany were legally zoned under the broad umbrella of entertainment or nightlife.
So they were lumped in with, like, arcades.
Legally speaking, a legendary venue like Trizzer was in the same municipal category as a casino or a brothel.
Wow.
Yeah. And because of that zoning, city planners often treated them as temporary noise nuisances. A luxury property developer could build a high-end apartment complex right next door to a club that had been there for 20 years.
Let me guess, the new wealthy tenants would complain about the bass.
Exactly. They would file noise complaints, and the club would be forced to shut down. The clubs had absolutely no legal ground to stand on.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I want you to imagine your favorite gritty, sweat-soaked underground dive bar. You know, the place with the sticky floors, the peeling paint, and the blown-out speakers.
We all have one of those.
Right. Now imagine that local city planners are suddenly legally mandated to treat that dive bar with the exact same architectural and cultural reverence as the Louvre or a National Opera House.
It's crazy to think about.
That is a massive cultural paradigm shift.
It really is. By upgrading them to cultural institutions, Parliament granted these clubs immense tax benefits. But far more importantly, it offered them an ironclad legal shield against urban displacement and gentrification.
So the developers can't just push them out anymore.
No. City planners can no longer zone a luxury complex next door and evict the club for noise. The club now has the prior right of existence. They are officially recognized as vital cultural assets that the state is obligated to preserve.
That's incredible. And the clubs immediately leveraged this new status, didn't they?
Oh, right away. Berghain, for instance, partnered with an art foundation. They temporarily transformed their massive, brutalist concrete venue into a contemporary art gallery called Studio Berlin.
Wait, they just put art on the dance floor?
Yeah. It quite literally functioned as a museum while dancing was illegal. Meanwhile, other foundational clubs like Watergate managed to survive that long winter through a combination of vital government aid, massive global fan donations, and the revenue generated from those online streaming events we talked about.
Okay, so these venues fortified themselves, they survived the winter, but the youth who are about to walk through those newly protected doors, they aren't the same people who left in 2019.
Not at all.
They've been marinating in these hyper-fast, heavily distorted TikTok edits for 2 years. So when those doors finally unlock in 2022, what happens when that pent-up digital energy hits a physical sound system?
Well, the music didn't just return, it mutated violently. When the clubs finally reopened their doors across Germany in 2022, the scene didn't go back to the comfortable 135 BPM cruise control of 2019.
I can imagine.
The hyper-fast, aggressive aesthetic that had been incubated and supercharged online during the lockdown, it was copy-pasted directly onto the physical dance floors.
The tempo's just skyrocketed, right?
Yeah. The data shows the new standard suddenly became 150 to 170 beats per minute.
170 BPM. That is a blistering, almost athletic speed.
It is exhausting just thinking about it. And producers weren't just playing faster. They were intentionally pushing their audio signals so far into the red that digital clipping actually became an instrument itself.
Digital clipping. You mean that harsh, crackling distortion you get when a speaker is overloaded?
Exactly. That aggressive, distorted crunch became the defining texture of the 2022 to 2024 era. They were mixing hard, industrial techno elements with euphoric 90s-era trance chords.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it created this incredibly dense, physically overwhelming wall of sound.
And the crowds just fully embraced that overwhelming sensation.
Absolutely. There was a massive influx of young, post-pandemic tourists, mostly from the EU, flooding back into Berlin, and they were absolutely starved for physical contact and kinetic release.
They just needed to move.
Right, and this era solidified the marathon rave, not just as a special holiday event, but as the standard baseline expectation.
Right, because we are talking about weekend parties regularly running for 30 to 40 hours continuously, which just demands a massive amount of physical stamina from the attendees.
It's a true marathon.
Which makes me want to ask you, the listener, a question. Think about this logically.
Mm.
If the music gets that fast, and the distortion gets that heavy, and the parties demand that you dance continuously for 40 hours straight,
Hmm.
does the music itself start to lose its nuance?
That's a really good question.
Does it sacrifice subtlety and intricate sound design for sheer brute force shock value? Or is this simply the raw, unfiltered sound of pure, bottled-up human release finally being uncorked after 2 years of confinement?
You know, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the lack of nuance is entirely the point. Yeah, it makes perfect psychological sense. The cycle we are looking at, this violent swing from a complete legally mandated silence to a 170 BPM, 40-hour distorted explosion, it perfectly mirrors the psychological whiplash of the pandemic itself.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
It is the sound of an entire generation purging 2 years of isolation, anxiety, and digital confinement through sheer, overwhelming physical volume. It wasn't about careful, subtle listening. It was about absolute catharsis.
Catharsis through clipping. I love that. But here's where it gets really interesting, because this explosion of energy didn't just stay contained within the concrete walls of Berlin.
No, it spread everywhere.
Right. The pandemic actually permanently altered the geographical map of German techno. Because everyone was grounded, the scene decentralized. If you can't travel to the techno capital, you have to build the capital in your own backyard.
Exactly. For decades, Berlin held a virtual monopoly on the global perception of German techno. It was this gravitational black hole that pulled all the international talent, media attention, and tourism into its orbit.
But the travel bans broke that monopoly.
Completely. As the scene decentralized, regional cities began to thrive and develop their own distinct post-pandemic identities.
So where did we see this happening?
Well, massive youth-driven scenes erupted in places like Frankfurt, which leaned heavily into harder, more aggressive event organizing.
Okay, Frankfurt went hard. What about the East?
In Leipzig, the club IFZ became a major national hub, drawing in massive crowds specifically looking for that new high-speed sound. In Hamburg, a new generation of young DJs began dominating the scene at the club PL.
And Dresden, too, right? I read about that in the column.
Yeah. In Dresden, there was a massive revival of the local grassroots rave culture. The talent pools spread out, and the whole culture became far more regionally diverse.
Meanwhile, Berlin is dealing with a bit of a hangover.
Hmm.
Despite winning those massive new legal protections, the pandemic brutally exposed Berlin's absolute over-reliance on international tourism.
It was a very harsh reality check.
Yeah. When the borders closed and the planes stopped landing, the city realized just how fragile its cultural economy actually was. In response, the Berlin government realized they could no longer just cater to the weekend EasyJet setters flying in for a party.
They needed a solid foundation.
Right, they had to shift their focus toward local cultural policies, trying to build a more sustainable ecosystem for the people who actually live and work in the city year-round.
And part of that new localized policy involves this massive government-supported push from 2023 onward to literally digitally archive the history, the sound, and the video of club culture.
The state archiving the clubs.
Yes, the state is actively funding the preservation of this culture as historical data, recognizing its fragility.
I want you to really consider the irony of that for a second. A subculture that was fundamentally built on the idea of sleeting, in-the-moment, unrecorded, sweat-soaked experiences in dark basements is now being officially archived, funded, and cataloged by the federal government.
It's totally wild when you say it out loud.
It's a complete inversion of its original rebellious ethos.
It really highlights just how far the pendulum has swung. The pandemic forced the state to recognize the immense cultural and economic value of the ephemeral, to the point where they now feel legally compelled to make it permanent.
It's fascinating.
When we synthesize all of this, the 2020s will undoubtedly be recorded in the history of electronic music as the era of disconnect.
The era of disconnect.
Yeah. It was a traumatic rupture that didn't just pause the culture, it forced a total ground-up redefinition of what techno is, how it is consumed, and how it is protected. Its survival depended entirely on its ability to untap to a reality where its core function, gathering in a dark room to dance, was literally illegal.
When you step back, you see a complete metamorphosis. I mean, the pandemic took a vulnerable nightlife economy, shattered it, and inadvertently armored it with high culture legal protections.
It saved it in a weird way.
It did. It took a steady 135 BPM rhythm and supercharged it into a blistering 170 BPM wall of distortion, driven entirely by a new, digitally native youth culture. And it finally broke Berlin's monopoly, sparking localized, fiercely independent scenes all across Germany.
It's a completely different landscape now.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question to ponder. We've seen exactly how this culture adapted to survive the unthinkable. But if a rebellious underground subculture requires state sponsorship, legal protection as high culture, and official government archiving just to survive a global crisis, can it truly remain underground?
That is the big question.
Or is the real future of techno a formalized, almost museum-like experience? Think back to that silent city we imagined at the start. The bass is pumping again, louder and faster than ever, but the concrete walls holding that sound in. They belong to the state now. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.